Hello and welcome to In Focus. I'm Anthony Moreno. Today we talk about a new book called The Final Mission, Preserving NASA's Apollo Sites, which highlights space archaeology and heritage. The book is authored by Lisa Westwood, Wayne Donaldson, and Dr. Beth O'Leary, Professor Emerita from the Department of Anthropology here at New Mexico State University. Thank you so much for joining us, Beth O'Leary.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, I'd like to talk about the book. Could you give us a brief description of the book and why it really came about?
Well, the book is about space archaeology and heritage, and it looks at sites, mostly within the United States, that were connected with a very extraordinary event. And that event, of course, is to put two guys on the moon on July 20th, 1969. And there are a myriad of facilities. We talk about space heritage as a cultural landscape. So there are rocket test stands, there are launch complexes, there's manufacturing facilities, and all of these contributed to getting those people up there on the moon and into outer space. So the book is a look at the historic context of the space era and what's happened to these properties now.
Now, I mean, you could probably give us a description of what has really happened to those properties. I mean, this is really something that hasn't been upkept.
Well, some of them are reused. You know, I worked out at White Sands Missile Range on Launch Complex 36, and that vehicle assembly building was created in 1960 for the Little Joe rocket. It's now been repurposed, and NASA starts and builds their sounding rockets there. So that is still in place, and that is still being used, albeit a little bit changed. Other things are abandoned in place at Cape Canaveral, some of the launch complexes. Where Apollo 1, that tragic fire took place, is simply 3 concrete pillars, and abandoned in place is stenciled on those pillars. So there are things that are preserved and are used ongoing, and then there are things that are in ruins.
Why is it so important to preserve this heritage and these artifacts?
For me, humanity went to the moon. I mean, it is the ultimate frontier to go into outer space. So I think because it's kind of recent, we're running up now on the 48th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing on the moon, we need to look back and say, how do we evaluate that era? You know, post-World War II, the Cold War, what happened in the world, and how did we get into space? So I think now is the time to look back, even though archaeologists tend to look at things much older than this, but it's time to look back and say, how can we evaluate the significant properties and protect them?
The book talks about the space race between the United States and the then Soviet Union. This was also going on during the Cold War between the two countries. How much did, the Cold War influence the space race?
Well, the Cold War was played out on Earth between ourselves and the Soviet Union, and it was also played out in space because it was a technological race, and the first group, the first country to get to the moon was going to win the scientific aspects of the Cold War. So we were in a very heated competition with Russia. Frank Borman once told me, he said, the trip that Apollo took, the Apollo astronauts took, was not a voyage of exploration or it was to try to test new technology. It was a battle in the Cold War, and I was a soldier. So the fact that we went into space really is set in the context of the Cold War, and the Cold War fashions a lot of the decisions made. 8 went very early because they thought the Russians are going to be first on the moon. They were first in everything else. Sputnik, first woman, first astronaut. So really it was part of the Cold War history.
Now that history was really felt when the then Soviet Union was able to launch Sputnik into the air. You talked about that in the book some. Could you really describe to us the impact that had on the United States at that time?
Well, it was a competition in the International Geophysical Year in 1957-58 to launch a satellite into Earth's orbit, and we competed mightily. There were many different teams, but the USSR and us were the big ones. When the Russians got there first and Sputnik went up, people were amazed. It was an amazing technological achievement, but also it signaled now we have a presence outside the Earth, and people were very afraid. People were afraid that space would become a place for weaponry and space would become a place for war. So it was a very trying time, and we didn't get up there really until Explorer 1 and then later Vanguard, which is still up there.
Yeah, the Vanguard is expected to be up there for many years to come. How many?
600 to 2,000 years. So that's a long curation time. So yeah, it's still up there. It even has its own website that tracks it.
Oh, wow. There's so much history, displayed in this book, but also history that connects New Mexico to the space race. Could you share with us about how New Mexico has contributed to the space race?
Well, there are a lot of ways that New Mexico contributed. Let me just mention a couple. One is Colonel John Stapp at Holloman Air Force Base, the fastest man on Earth, who rode a rocket sled over 600 miles an hour to test the G-force on astronauts. And his ability to withstand that and the equipment that was developed in order to allow him to do that, and a 10-mile track at Holloman, is New Mexico's contribution. Colonel Joe Kittinger jumped over the Tularosa Basin in 1960, 19.5 miles above the surface of the Earth to test the parachutes. So these two guys and these two experiments really helped people get into space and helped the astronauts survive in space during the space race.
And there's also a connection between the Apollo Tranquility site and New Mexico. Could you share with us a little bit about what that is?
Right. Well, the New Mexico Museum of Space History has a plaque, and on it are the coordinates of the Space Museum in New Mexico, and they are linked to the coordinates on the Apollo 11 site on the moon. So it's the first registered space heritage site. Also in 2010, working with my students here in anthropology in a grad seminar, we nominated it to the State Register of Cultural Properties. So the Tranquility Base site is now on the New Mexico Register of Cultural Properties because of our connections and our history in developing all of the spacecraft and the rockets that put those guys there.
The space race, you mentioned that, we're going, this has been decades ago, and there's been generations that have grown up after, man stepped on the moon. Mm-hmm. How do you make that connection to the generations of today, millennials, and then so on, about the importance of preserving these artifacts?
Well, I think you make them aware of the incredible intelligence and dedication and just plain great science and engineering that went into it. And it still needs to be done. The Google X Prize has a competition now to get a robotic on the moon. So hopefully students and younger people can say, hey, this is such an incredibly interesting endeavor and involves so much intelligence and planning and development of ideas that I'd like to be part of that. I mean, I wanted to be an astronaut. I hope that people in the future will too.
Could you share with us a little bit about what it was like during that time to, have these launches and the excitement behind them, and also, the competition that existed in the world between countries to get into space and to be on the moon? I mean, these were must-see events that were happening and unfolding before our eyes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I believe that over 600 million people either watched or listened to the early broadcasts of Armstrong and Aldrin on the moon. So the whole world was involved. It was set in the Cold War, so of course there was nervousness and fear about, what would happen next. But people were aware that something they look at every night or watch or fall in love with had people on it for the first time. And the landscape was desolate but beautiful. I think that people were enchanted with the fact that this is a presence in the night sky, and now we have the technology to visit there. And it really is the only celestial body humans have been on.
Wow. Well, I really want to thank you so much for joining us on In Focus, and also thank you very much for your work in explaining, the history that we have right in front of our eyes today.
Well, thank you.
And we want to thank you for joining us for In Focus. I'm Anthony Moreno.